is orienting us for the rest of the lecture, this particular lecture today. We're talking about term milk, and last time we talked about the differences in milk, like the milk that's first produced by the breast is called colostrum, and colostrum is a thin, kind of yellowish fluid that has a lot of immune components to it. And you remember we talked about the infant's stomach is very small right at first, so small amounts of fluid matter, and then the stomach size, reservoir size starts to get bigger and bigger. So now we're talking about term milk, which comes in around lactogenesis 3, maybe around 10 days after birth. And this milk stays more or less the same. Now, milk is not a static, like the infant formula is a recipe, right? So it's always the same. Human milk is real different from, I mean, it's basically the same, but it varies based on time of day and also to some extent maternal diet, and also when mom is exposed to a pathogen. So for example, let's look at COVID, for example. If COVID is, if the coronavirus infection exists in the household, if mom has that infection and is producing, or immunization is producing antibodies, then those antibodies can enter into the milk and affect the infant's health and help provide protection. I've had, not with COVID, but with other situations, I've had upfront experiences with people when my children were staying at a person's house when they were young. One of the people that brought their daughter there didn't have her vaccinations, and no one told us. So her daughter got whooping cough, pertussis, and all the kids that had been immunized had a subclinical case, but it was really scary. My daughter had the strangest cough I'd ever heard. But the mother, whose house this was at, had a 3-week-old baby, and she was breastfeeding the baby. And so the fact that she was breastfeeding the baby helped the baby get through that scenario without getting whooping cough. Now, we don't want to call that as the only way to protect against whooping cough. We need our vaccinations, but just letting you know that human milk has some capacities that are responsible to the environment. Okay, so back just to where we were. I'm just kind of giving you an overview here again. So we'll start out, we talked about water and calories last time, and we left off talking about carbohydrates. So I'll go through here quickly. We mentioned last time that extra water is not needed as long as the kid is getting, unless the kid is very sick, but as long as they're being breastfed. We talked about how calories are different, and that breastfed infants basically consume fewer calories for a variety of reasons. We went through this last time. And that also human milk affects the microbes that live in the gut, and this may affect risk for obesity. So calories and the whole effect of breastfeeding may affect the risk for childhood obesity. It is a protective thing. We talked about a way of getting around that called pace feeding, where an infant can be held up and not be fed so much fluid at the same time. And so we left off here on carbohydrates. So just still talking about term milk. And the most important part of this particular topic is not the first bullet, but the second. But let me just tell you the first bullet. Lactose is the primary carbohydrate in human milk, just like cow milk and other animal milks, mammal milks, right? All animals that produce milk are mammals. But so the other component, which is probably not familiar to you unless you've learned something about breastfeeding, is phenomenal. There are carbohydrate components. Now you remember oligosaccharides, and oligo means few, so a few sugar molecules stuck together would be an oligosaccharide. There are oligosaccharides in human milk. The other term is glycans, and mothers produce hundreds of unique HMOs. And that means her breast milk is this complex substance, much different than infant formula. There's been no way for infant formula to mimic this. There's been a couple that they've tried to mimic, but it's just not, it's not the same thing at all. So there's hundreds. And one mom will have different component of these HMOs than another mom will. And it'll differ from one baby to the next. So this is a unique feature of human milk that is expressed between the mother and the infant. And what do these things do? They're responsible for so many important aspects of human of breastfeeding. First, they act as prebiotics. So they stimulate the growth of beneficial bacteria, which helps kids not get sick and also helps them grow. And it prevents pathogen attachment. And I'm going to show you that on the next slide. I'm going to give you an illustration of that. But if an infant is exposed to a pathogen like salmonella, these HMOs may protect against infection. Also, they stimulate the maturity of the maturation of the intestinal epithelium. So the infant gastrointestinal tract matures and gets more whole, enhances the immune response, and helps with brain development, and then also prevents a terrible condition called necrotizing enterocolitis. The next two slides, I'm going to expound on number 2 and then on number 4. So this is a picture of how those HMOs can work. And I'm a diagram person, and several of you mentioned in your who am I share what you shared with me is that you also like to see things visually. So here's an example, and this is, so let me orient you to this slide. So these are intestinal cells in an infant's GI tract. This here is the middle of the lumen of the intestine. This is a bacteria. They should make an evil face on it. So this is a pathogenic bacteria. And this is a normal cell surface receptor. If there are no oligosaccharides here, if a baby's formula fed and they get exposed to this bacteria, the bacteria can bind to these cell receptors, enter into the cell, disrupt cell structure, cause dysentery, cause an infection, and so forth. So this is the norm. And we mentioned last time that internationally, formula feeding can be devastating for the health of infants, because if the water is impure and they get exposed to such bacteria, they don't really have any protection. Breast milk offers an awful lot of protection. So the second panel here shows one way that these oligosaccharides can work. So here's the same bacteria, here's the same cell, here's the same cell receptor. But the difference is, in this milk, there is an oligosaccharide that comes in mom's milk. It's in the intestine with all the rest of the milk components. It chemically looks like this cell receptor. So instead of the bacteria binding here and causing damage, it can bind these HMOs, and that renders them ineffective. So they just are digested and then they go away, and then they're not allowed to take a hold and cause a big infection. So this is a really cool concept. And the last one's a little more involved, and just basically what happens is some of these oligosaccharides actually change what receptors are made on the cell. So instead of making this one that this bacteria likes so much, it changes the structure. So it's not, the pathogenic bacteria aren't able to attach. So this is a very interesting area of research in human milk, and we can learn from this in trying to improve infant formula. Can you manufacture compounds similar to this and add them to formula? Right now, the state of research is not very advanced, but it will be becoming more advanced. So you can find infant formulas now that say, HMOs added, but it's not the same thing as this. There's no way there are hundreds of individual HMOs added. Are there any questions about this?
Can you explain the last step again, the third one?
Yeah. Okay. So here we go. So this guy's just floating around. Okay. So here's the oligosaccharide coming from the milk, and it interacts in its own way with a cell. It can cross or have its own receptor, and somehow affect the synthesis process of the cell. So instead of this cell making this cell receptor, which the bacteria likes so much, there's a change in DNA expression, and so a different cell, and this is going to have protein and also have carbohydrates attached. So a different receptor is made that doesn't look like this one. And so this looks different and it's chemically different, and so the bacteria can't attach to it. So just gives you an example. These are examples of how these things work. Does that make sense, Vanessa? Okay, cool. Okay, so the next one is not a pleasant thing to look at. I told you number 6, we would look at this slide. This is a picture of a small intestine from an infant who died. This is look how inflamed it is. This is called necrotizing, which is like necrotic, enterocolitis, which is inflammation of the gut. And what happens to some premature infants in particular is when they are fed, their gut is not that mature. They're young still. They're sometimes too young. And so the medical staff needs to provide nutrition at the same time not damage the gastrointestinal tract. And when kids, about 3 to 7% of premature infants develop this condition. And once that happens, about half of them die. So it's really, really very sad. So we, in the medical profession now, when infants, premature infants are born and they start feeding them, if mom can provide the milk, that's the best case scenario. But she's never breastfed, getting pumping may work for some and may be harder for others. But we also have human milk banks. And across the nation, there's one in Austin, the Austin Human Milk Bank. And people who are lactating who make extra milk, and some women are very efficient at lactation, and they can pump and actually make too much, and so they can store it, and if they don't need it for their infant, they can donate it. And then the milk banks process it, they run through filters, they get rid of any viruses or anything like that. So there's all this processing to make sure that it's safe. And then physicians can write prescriptions for this banked human milk to help protect infants from necrotizing enterocolitis. Okay, so this is another, just giving you an example of how human milk makes a world of difference. Okay, that's all about carbohydrates. The main thing to remember, of course, is lactose, but good detail about HMOs, because what I would like you to be able to do is explain to people when you're interacting professionally, explain to people the difference between human milk and formula. And there's many things that are the same that we've talked about, but the differences are really kind of profound.
I have
Okay.
a question.
Yes.
Are these HMOs just secreted naturally, or like is there a way for the mother's body to detect like that the baby's getting bacteria or something like that?
I think what I heard you say is yes, they're created naturally, but she's going to make them in response. There's just communication going on with her and exposure to the environment. So if she's exposed to certain pathogens, and if the infant has the pathogens, there's a likelihood that she's going to make HMOs that are more helpful.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Okay, so I don't have a lot to say about protein, except, okay, and this is going to sound like your food science lecture, because I know when you took food science, you learned about whey proteins and casein. But there's a couple of things about whey proteins I want you to know that's specific to human milk. One of the proteins in particular is called lactoferrin. And we mentioned this last slide. It was just on a list here, and I said I would talk about it some more. Lactoferrin binds iron. So imagine in the milk, iron, instead of being in a free form, is bound to lactoferrin. So it's protein bound. This compound also helps with the immune function by one, making sure the infant gets the iron, not pathogens, and two, keeps the iron away from microbes. So because iron is bound to lactoferrin, microbes like iron, and they would really like to get a hold on this infant nutrition and get in there and get that iron. But lactoferrin sort of helps play keep away. So that's an interesting piece in human milk. And there are some formulas where they have studies where they have tried to add lactoferrin to infant formula to see if it has the same benefit for our health outcomes. And I'm not really sure what the state of knowledge is about that. The problem is infant formula, they add a whole lot of iron to it because it's not very bioavailable. So it's kind of a different mix. Okay. And the other protein is, the other thing I won't ask you, alpha-lactalbumin, is just, this is a common whey protein. I'm more interested in knowing this lactoferrin is so important. And just also know that these two categories of proteins are here, and casein is just, it's what, for fun fact, right? Helps keep calcium soluble and makes milk white. So, so the next nutrient, macronutrient, is lipids. Notice how much breast milk has. Infant formula is made to mimic this, and so infant formula and human milk are rich in lipids. This is normal, this is good, all right? And when infants start to eat real foods later, and we'll talk about that, what happens is that changes the lipid composition of their diet, of course. And so, but just so you know, we start out with a really high fat diet, and this is appropriate for brain development and everything else. The growth, the quantity, how much lipid, it's pretty stable, but it will vary with the time of day and sometimes during a feeding. We talked about this last time. I mentioned fore milk and hind milk, how if this is the breast here and this is where the nipple is, or the milk that's going to come out first, it's going to have more water in it. And if the infant continues to nurse from that breast, then the milk that comes from the back of the breast is higher in fat, and that helps with satiety. So the first part helps with providing enough water, and then the second part helps with getting the infant to be full. Okay, and then quality. Now this is interesting. So mom can eat regular, just the typical American diet, and the lipid content of her milk is going to reflect that. And what's important is she needs to eat her essential fatty acids. And I'm not going to talk about omega-6s here because I do this later, because that's not usually a problem in the American diet. Most Americans consume oil in one way or another, and probably too much of it, right? With fried foods or, salad dressings. There's so many ways that we can get the omega-6 fatty acids, but omega-3s are the ones, the long chain ones are found primarily in fish. Now, later in the semester, I'll break this down a little more, but it's important to know that fish consumption increased by mom increases the omega-3 content of her milk, and that may improve visual acuity and cognitive development in the infant. So again, when we get to pregnancy and infant nutrition, we'll talk about this some more, but she needs to consume omega-3s. And probably some of the questions you have may have to do with, well, is it okay if you just use flaxseed oil and soybean oil and things like that? Because a lot of people are interested in alternatives and not wanting fish. And the answer is no, those aren't good enough. However, if mom can't eat fish, has a seafood allergy, but can consume supplements, that's probably the best next step. There are other foods that are fortified. Again, I'll talk about this later, but I just want to kind of fill this out for you. Okay. Okay. The last picture, again, I like pictures, and we talked about this. Wait, did I do this? No. Okay. I talked about this when I talked about secretion. You remember when I showed you the diagram that showed how salts and living cells and so forth got into the milk. We talked about the cuboidal cells. And so this is a cuboidal cell lining the alveoli, right? Is the alveoli that produces milk. And remember, we talked about how some components, in particular the fat, get pinched off from the cell. So fat is synthesized and also accumulated because of mom's diet. And then this is the cell that's going to secrete the milk. This is called a milk fat globule. And there's actually, her body puts a membrane on the outside of it. This membrane comes through. So this is a membrane, a pinched off part of the cell membrane. It's got proteins and lipids and so forth. And this is the form that fats take in human milk. So when the infant's consuming milk, it's this stuff. It's not like taking a bottle of vegetable oil and so forth, and adding the components. And it's thought that that this may have some benefit for the infant, maybe just in intestinal development. Maybe they feel better from it, but there also may be some other benefits, such as enhanced cognition. No questions?
What kind of secretion was this called? Because I remember learning about it, not the membrane, but like the type of secretion that the cell does.
Okay, I used to teach physiology. There's epicrine, and no, that's not a paracrine. I think it's apicrine, but y'all probably remember more. I taught that course in development, but I can't remember the answer right now. Do y'all remember?
Yeah, I think it's apicrine.
Okay. Where you pinch off, right? You pinch off a part of the membrane. We should.
Yeah, I remembered it by thinking apicrine is a piece of the cell goes with the excretion.
Oh, cool. Did y'all have this last semester with Miss Mingy?
Yes.
Cool. Okay. So now I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to talk about 4 micronutrients in human milk. Now, you know they're all in there, right? So human milk is a complete nutritionally, except for there can be 4 issues. So when I get to each part of the lifespan, if there's a particular nutrient that could be a problem, I focus on those. Because I can't start out and talk about riboflavin, thiamine, and niacin and for every age group, or our heads would pop. So I only talk about the ones that might be an issue for that group or in that particular food. So for breastfed infants, everything's great, but there are potentially 4 problems. And this is what people need to be aware of. So I'll talk about vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamin B12, and iron. Here's a kid with infants. Here's an infant with rickets. You can see how I need some more sleep. Rickets is a condition caused by lack of vitamin D during development. And so the skeleton is soft. When infants start to stand up, their legs can't support it. And so they develop the characteristic bowed legs, and also their structure, their overall skeletal structure is wrong. I'm sorry about the sound. I just didn't remember that was in here. Vitamin D is naturally low in human milk. This is such a big deal. Please remember this. I always ask this question on the exams. So what do we do? Okay, first, how do we know? So first, it varies with diet and sunshine exposure. So if mom lives in around the equator, she's going to have a lot more sun exposure. And also, if her skin is lighter, she's going to be more likely to make vitamin D. If her skin is darker, she's going to be less likely to make vitamin D from sun exposure. And so it depends on her diet. If she's taking supplements, then or consuming vitamin D, that can affect her status too. But infants are at risk if they're exclusively breastfed because vitamin D can be naturally low in human milk. And if the infants are in a location with limited sunlight, if they have darker skin. Think about a map of the United States. In Boston right now, there's not enough sunlight to make vitamin D, even with normal exposure. So because we inhabit so much of the globe, vitamin D nutrition is a problem in the winter months in particular. So what are we supposed to do to make up for this? The American Academy of Pediatrics says that the infants should get 400 IU per day beginning shortly after birth. That it means we need to start supplementing infants right away on a daily basis. And this may seem counterintuitive. You may think, well, it's not natural. Why should we do this? But it is a fact, and it may be a problem because we don't have very much sun exposure anymore. We use sunscreens, we stay indoors. You're indoors right now, right? Our ancestors were indoors all the time. So our lives our exposures have changed. So this is important. Now, how do you get a supplement into a breastfed kid? Well, they have droppers, and I'm annoyed at droppers of things sometimes because they're very sweet. Baby Advil or baby Tylenol stuff is in a real sickly, syrupy, sweet solution. And here we are trying to develop these taste preferences for healthy food and then give them medicine that tastes like candy. But there are some drops that mom can get that they're just a small vitamin D drop, and she can put them on the nipple before she breastfeeds. And that's how a baby gets it. So it's a real easy way to do it. Also, this is relatively new. It's been known for about 5 years that mom can take high dose supplements. And this is over the UL, but there's been no documented danger of this. So she's just bound to determine not to give the kid any supplements, and she can take this. And this will increase the amount of vitamin D in human milk adequately. Moving on to vitamin K. This is another, and this is a whole interesting concept here. The term here is vitamin K deficiency bleeding. That is a condition newborns are at risk for unless they're properly handled, because their vitamin K status is not good at birth. Okay, so they have that right after birth, newborns have low K status and they're at risk for hemorrhaging. If you recall, K got its name from clotting, the German word for clotting or something. And so we need vitamin K in order to clot, for blood to clot. Right at first, infants aren't really good at clotting. And this may make sense because birth is not all that friendly and their head gets mushed around. You've ever seen a baby that's took a couple hours to push out, they have a little cone head and stuff. And so that there's a lot of kind of stress that happens during that process. And so you don't really want clotting to happen there because that could be damaging. But after the baby's born, then it needs to develop the ability to clot. So it doesn't have, if there was any problem, it doesn't have any excessive bleeding in the brain. So when they're born, there's not much sent across the placenta in the first place, and they don't really have, and the intestines aren't really sterile, but they're sort of sterile. They're not vitamin K synthesizing bacteria at the time of birth. And their vitamin K cycle's just not working yet. So they're just too immature to have functional vitamin K. Now, what kids are at more risk, it depends on mom's behaviors. If mom has been taking some medications and that cause, especially cause bleeding, like such as aspirin or antibiotics that kill bacteria that could make vitamin K, then she may increase the risk for the infant. And then if the newborn is little at birth, okay, so premature, low birth weight, and so forth, and exclusive breastfeeding. This is the risk because naturally human milk is not high in vitamin D. I mean, vitamin K, also vitamin K. Sorry, I just jumped here. Okay, this is because with exclusive breastfeeding, there's not enough vitamin K to provide the nutrition needed right at first. Okay, so what do we do about it? We give an injection. Vitamin K shot at birth. This is supported by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Midwives do it. It's commonly done. I used to include a slide on what happens when people don't do it. I'll explain it to you. What happens when people turn down the shot? You know, we have a national problem right now, and nationally, people don't trust vaccines and they don't trust anything that's injected. And there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it causes illness, in some cases death. So when people deny or decline the shot, then what can happen is over the first 2 months, they may develop this vitamin K deficiency bleeding, and they may have hemorrhages in the brain, and this can affect, it can cause death, or it can affect cognitive function and make them sick. So this is something that we need to do. It's done automatically in a birthing center and in the hospitals. They just give them a shot, but I just know that sometimes people turn these down. Got it? Okay, so the question, go.
I have a question. So you mentioned that, when, during birth, the infant's head has to be, squeezed through the pelvis. It gets very, I guess, bruised and misshapen and stuff. And there's probably some bleeding that might happen. So after the baby's born, they immediately give the vitamin K shot, like within the first few minutes. So that doesn't have an effect on, like a negative effect on clotting?
No, it absolutely doesn't. It's considered safe. And there are some urban legends about vitamin K being, I forget what it is, associated with some weird outcomes, and they don't exist. It's much more safer. It's much safer to take a shot. Sometimes they don't do it right after birth. I mentioned this later. If to support breastfeeding, sometimes they'll put the infant on mom first, and after the first breastfeeding, then they'll do the shots. But it's a good question.
Yeah. Another comment is that they don't actually explain to you what the shot is for. They just ask because they're supposed to ask you before they administer it, but they don't really. You're, and it's kind of, birth is so crazy, right? And there's so much stuff going on. You're tired. This whole thing is happening, and then you have a doctor coming up to you asking, like, "Is it okay if I give them a vitamin K shot?" It'd be nice for them to provide more information prior to the birth so that the mothers kind of know what to expect.
Well, isn't that true? That would be great prenatal care, right? So here's what's going to happen at birth, and here's why. Ugh. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next nutrient is vitamin B12. And in many cases, vitamin B12 is not a problem. Mom's fine, her status is fine, baby's fine, gets it in the milk, it's not a problem. But sometimes mom can increase her risk for not having enough B12 in her milk. This can be due to diet. It can be due to disease like celiac disease or gastric bypass surgery where they remove a good bit of the stomach. In that case, we need the stomach to absorb vitamin B12. It doesn't get absorbed there, but we need things that are made in the stomach called intrinsic factor for vitamin B12 to be absorbed later. So if the stomach's not there, then we lose our capacity to absorb vitamin B12 from foods. Okay, and then also there's certain medications that interfere with B12 status. So there's several issues that revolve around mom's life that can affect the amount of B12 in the milk. So what are the outcomes? If the amount of B12 is too low, then infants can experience seizures, apathy, anemia, developmental delay, and failure to thrive, which means they don't grow. So it's very serious. So the next slide, I have some more information about this. Mom needs vitamin B12. Her DRI is just a little higher than normal. Normal for non-pregnant people is 2.4 micrograms today, so she just needs 2.6. It's a very small amount. And if she's not sick and she eats a well-rounded diet, she's going to have plenty of B12. But it is naturally absent in plant foods, and if she leaves out, all animal products, then she's at risk. And so if she's going to be a vegan, she should take multivitamins anyway, a vitamin B12 supplement, and then also she can get B12 from a variety of fortified products, right? Because we add B12 as a fortified nutrient. Make sense? Okay. The last nutrient that we're going to highlight in breast milk is iron. And I mentioned you guys, not that you remember everything I say, but I mentioned you the first day of class how my personal philosophy of nutrition is I'm pro-vegetarian. I became a pescatarian like 15 years ago because I really think we need omega-3 fats. But I've been a vegetarian for a long time because of animal farming. So and those practices. But I want you to understand that I give advice different from my personal practices based on the literature. Okay, and so here's what my understanding of the literature says is that iron in human milk is bioavailable, and this is just a reminder that it's transferred by lactoferrin. And infants can be deficient, not necessarily when they're little, but they can start running out of iron stores. And let me say this. I have this on the last bullet here. They're born with enough iron to last like 4 to 6 months. So they can just have the little bit that's in human milk that's highly bioavailable works just fine till maybe 4 to 6 months. But at that point, they start to need more iron. This is one of the reasons we start adding food to the diet. We can't just have kids breastfeed for a full year without eating foods. For one thing, they need to learn how to eat, and they need to get all that motor skill development, and it's appropriate. But also the nutrition, the content of human milk doesn't support an infant in and of itself for that first year. It needs to be supplemented with food. And iron deficiency is so serious. Iron deficiency, this is the third bullet, can affect cognitive development. And what that means, this would affect, maybe you wouldn't see it in an infant, but you'd see this infant as it grows. If it's not given enough iron during this particular time, you can see a drop in IQ points. It's never fixed. So it's not like you can fix anemia later and then the cognitive capacity comes back up again. It can cause permanent damage. This is one of the biggest public health issues in the world, maternal and child iron deficiency. So in the United States, you know, we have too much food. We probably many people have consume enough iron, but there are people that don't. And also, if infants are born small, you know, they may not have as good a stores, and so they can be at great risk. So what is a general recommendation? And when I get to feeding infants and toddlers, I'll have this whole section on what are you supposed to feed them and how. We'll go over this again, but I want to introduce this concept here. After 4 to 6 months, infants may need supplements and they will need appropriate complementary food. Now, I'm not real happy with this chicken and gravy example because this is just a highly processed food. So I don't really like this picture so much, but baby food meats, if the family eats meats, if they cook chicken, for example, they can take chicken and put it in a little pulverizer and put water in it and puree it and give it to them that way. It's real easy to do. You can mix it with other foods. But baby food meats are helpful. So are iron fortified cereals. And with conscious addition of those items, then infants can avoid iron deficiency anemia. But you just need to know they're at risk at around 4 to 6 months. And breastfed kids are more at risk than formula-fed infants because a whole lot of iron is added to formula. So they're constantly consuming more. It doesn't always make them feel good. The iron can make their stomach hurt and cause discomfort, but it can also keep their iron stores up. So there's pros and cons. So knowing that iron can be an issue for infants is all the education that you need and how to go about consuming healthy foods. When we get to how to feed first foods, it's important to think about this because there's not really a lot of room in the diet for junk food. So many American kids are given junk food, you know, chips and, you know, whatever garbage passes for food in this country. And they really need high nutrient dense foods. So we'll get to that again later. Any questions about iron?
Just wondering, so if the family is vegan or whatever, just the iron fortified cereals is pretty much their only options?
Well, there's also, you know, I'm giving you like a quick and dirty response to this, and I'll give you, when I get to the formal lecture on adding first foods, I'll go into more detail about this. But, you know, there are other good sources, right? For example, it's like beans and foods like that can provide a good amount of iron. And so you can give those foods as well, you know, and that'll help. But the bioavailability is not as high as if it's in meats. But the fortified cereal seems to do it. As long as people are consistent about it, based on papers I just read, as long as people are consistent about it, it seems pretty helpful. So they don't have to give them meat. I bring in, you know, I bring this up, and you know how I feel about this. I recommend my daughter's. She's got a 9-month-old baby now, and they have some, you know, she doesn't eat meat, but she has some baby food meat that she's giving him on a regular basis until he gets up to a year, and the doctors don't check iron status till a year. So it's just a shot in the dark between birth and a year unless the child gets sick. So we don't even know. And we may miss iron deficiency anemia right early on. So that's why prevention by having healthful foods really matters. Meat's not necessarily serious. And I told her that too. It just makes it easy. That's a great question. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm gonna.
I also had a question.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's still a huge push for it, but I remember at one point in time, whenever they were saying that like consuming your placenta, if like that provided some type of like nutrients, I was wondering if like that was more so for the mother, or it also like was complementary for the baby as well, and if that's like actually something that like is very helpful, or if that was just kind of like a fad type of thing.
Well, that's a fun question. When I get to I'll talk about maternal development, you know, and I'll talk about the placenta development and so forth. I'll bring it up again. It's called placentophagy, which is eating placenta, right? And people do it, you know, some people have their placenta dried and put in pills and all these kinds of things. there's no evidence that's beneficial. And there's some people who have gotten sick from it. Because what the placenta is, it's kind of a filtering organ, you know, where it filters out toxins and stuff like that. So it sounds cool for people, but when you look at, and there's not a lot of people studying it, you know, and so I can have looked before and just found a couple, 3 papers. There's like one group of researchers that look at it, but there's I would never recommend that. Now I might do something different, like save cord blood, right? It can be used to help an infant later on if you need the cells from that or something. That's something that's sort of new age that may be beneficial, but eating the placenta, you know, nah. Now animals eat their placenta, but it's not because they need a supplement. They eat it so that they don't smell like blood anymore, right? So they consume it so the smell of birth and the vulnerability around having, you know, young is kind of protected against. Thank you. I love fun questions. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start the second lecture, and I'm going to remember to share my screen. Okay, y'all with me?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so this is part 2. There are only 2 lectures for breastfeeding, but they take about 3 days to talk about. This lecture gets more into some of the nuts and bolts of breastfeeding, and also policies and how much it matters and what do we know about how much it helps families and so forth. So we'll start out with talking about some recommendations and then some practices. So important sources, I won't ask you this, but when I showed you that I have lots of materials for you on the Canvas site, I recommend that you download those materials, keep them in a folder so that you have a library of your knowledge of lifespan nutrition that you can carry forward. Some of you will be taking an RD exam and will be asked questions from lectures like this. Yeah, those of you that go into that, and then also if you consider in your career, these are baseline papers that are cited often. And so this is where I get my information along with your textbook, but where I get current information and what recommendations are. So just, this is an FYI slide. And then in the next few slides, I'm going to show you what these organizations say. This policy statement has still not been updated, but the American Academy of Pediatrics updates state position papers, and the Breastfeeding and the Use of Human Milk is a well-known article that's constantly referenced. And what they say is breastfeeding human milk are normative standards. Given the documented medical and neurodevelopment advantages, infant nutrition should be considered a public health issue, not only a lifestyle choice. And the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics article, human milk is considered the optimal form of infant nutrition for nearly all infants. And the risks of not getting human milk include increased rates of infant and maternal morbidity, which means they get ill, and mortality, which means they're more likely to die. Increased healthcare costs and significant economic losses to families and employers. I'll give you some examples of this. This is the strength of these position statements. And then also the American Association of Family Physicians, they pretty much say the same thing. They recommend that all babies, with rare exceptions, be breastfed and or receive expressed human milk exclusively for the first 6 months of life. The dietary guidelines for Americans just came out, like over the holidays. They also say the same exact information. And then there's a CDC, and they say the same thing too. So everyone is committed in the United States. Organizations are committed to supporting breastfeeding. But you know, we talked about this last time. Even though we know it's important and public health initiatives are out there, the reality is it is very difficult for women who have to go back to work early to be able to establish lactation and continue. They can. Some of them can keep it up for a full year, but it depends on practices in the workplace. Is there lactation room? I was on a committee a few years ago at Texas State where someone in HR got a grant to put in lactation rooms on campus, at least for faculty and staff, and then some students were able to use it. So, there's government money to do that, and so that way people have a place besides a bathroom during the workday to be able to pump milk in privacy and store it, right? And so initiatives like that make the world of difference. Also initiatives like not allowing formula manufacturers to provide formula in hospitals makes a world of difference, because they can get families hooked on formula while they're still trying to get breastfeeding worked out. I'll talk about this some more, but it's just kind of a common theme. So we know this is important, but how achievable it is sometimes is confusing for people. So one question that was asked on the first day is, how long? And so this is a slide on duration, and everyone pretty much agrees, exclusively for 6 months, then start adding food. We've already talked about why, right? Because human milk is not sufficient after 6 months to provide all the nutrition. And the World Health Organization says extend duration to 2 years or beyond. We talked about this. The reason is, in developing countries, in particular, infants and infants and toddlers are at risk for dying because of their exposure to the water, unclean water. And so they're more likely to survive if they're breastfed for an extended period of time. And so there's no cap. No one says, oh, let's just, and you must stop here, but it's going to happen. Infants, you don't have teenagers, you don't have big kids running around nursing. And if you do, it's straight, not teenagers. That was a hyperbolic statement just for fun, but you know, they're going to stop. People stop doing this, and it's most people stop well before they should. And extended breastfeeding is not as weird as you might think it is, and it's not very common. It doesn't hurt anything. In developing countries, kids are often breastfed till 4 or 5 years old. This spaces births, as we talked about last time, and it keeps the kids alive. What happens when there's high rates of infant death is women just keep getting pregnant over and over again. They don't have any access to birth control, so they have this horrible cycle of having an infant, then the infant dies, getting pregnant again, having an infant, the infant dies. And so in situations like this, the breastfeeding relationship changes their entire life, right? You can't imagine going through something horrific like that without having any of the resources that we pretty much take for granted in this country. So notice I say don't wait past 6 months. I've mentioned that. I just want to make sure you understand that, and it's front and center in your mind, that breast milk or formula is not adequate at 6 months. It's around 6 months. It's time to start feeding the kids. We'll talk about what you look for, like is a 5-month-old ready, or is it, you know, should you wait till 6 months? It has to do with the kids' developmental and development and behavior. So I'll talk about that again. So just want to introduce this concept for you here. Okay, little bit about science. There are, if you do your literature search on breastfeeding, you type in PubMed, lactation or breastfeeding, and any other terms such as child obesity or asthma or allergies, and there's so many papers, thousands and thousands and thousands of papers sometimes. So you have to kind of hone in on what are you looking for. But so many of these studies have looked at correlation. I know you've got, many of y'all had the statistics or the nutrition research class yet? Some of you have. Okay, so you haven't yet. All right. So here's the deal. Studies that have looked at a correlation, like if kids are breastfed, they're more likely to have these outcomes. They don't establish cause and effect by their research design. They only look to see if things are correlated. And a correlation doesn't mean cause and effect, right? So kids that are more likely to, that are breastfed longer, have lower risk for obesity. This has actually been established by other methods besides just correlation. But if we look at infant, breastfeeding and some other outcome, we're not really sure in many cases if there's really a strong relationship. And so we have to look at all the research carefully. And you know what the problem is we can't do a study with humans. To do this right, you would take, let's say, 1,000 women, variety of race, ethnicity, income levels, and so forth, randomize them into 2 groups when they have, or 3 groups, 2, when after birth, then you say, okay, you guys, this half that I randomly chose, y'all all breastfeed your baby for 6 months. And the other group, you say, okay, you guys give them formula. Can you set up a study like that? Why not?
There might be a negative impact to not breastfeeding, and so you might be inadvertently hurting the child.
That's a very, very good point. Anybody else?
Now, I was going to say something along the same lines that it's a little unethical to put infants at risk for the sake of a study.
Well, the other thing, yeah, that's absolutely perfect. One of the other things is I have worked with human beings in research for a very long period of time, over 30 years, and they suck as subjects. They're just terrible. You know, in animal studies, you can divide them and feed them what you want and then look at the outcomes, and you can be confident in your results because you can show cause and effect. But with humans, they're, you know, just because you say, okay, you're going to breastfeed for 6 months, do you think they're actually going to do that? What if it's not going well for them? You know, what if they have to go to work? There's so many reasons we talked about. And then what if they wanted to breastfeed and you put them in the formula group? And this is what you guys are saying. You're saying, well, that's not really ethical. So it won't work. You can't set up a study that way and the other problem is there's not enough people that are actually exclusively breastfeeding in this country to have a really good example of the effective breastfeeding. And we still need so much support for this so that it's the norm. You know, in the 1940s, it was just absolutely the norm. And then we talked about this, by the time you get to the 1970s, formula was all the rage. And we've been slowly clawing our way back to having more and more breastfeeding, but there's so many barriers. So we don't even have a good sample to study. So what researchers do is they do something called a systematic review, and they take all the papers using some keywords like breastfeeding, obesity, breastfeeding duration, and so forth. And they take all of the studies and they look through all of them to see what they find. And they decide how many show a connection, how many don't show a connection, and then summarize the state of knowledge. And so then they can summarize and say, you know, there's pretty good evidence, considering all the studies that have been done, there's pretty good evidence that breastfeeding helps protect against child obesity. And so we have some strength, some strong evidence, and then we have some weaker evidence because human studies are just really hard to do, especially this kind. So what we can say about the benefits of breastfeeding, we can say a lot in animal models. We can say a lot because we can control those experiments. But when it comes to, and that's not bread, they don't also have breastfeeding, they're, you know, that are fed human milk, right? But with humans, we have to look at what the best we can do with these studies. Okay, so.
Good question. So something that I've noticed and the reason why nutrition seems to be such an uphill battle and such an uphill fight is that most of their studies rely on like self-reporting. So it's really hard to have like really solid evidence for a lot of things. Is there like a movement to try to combat that issue?
It's all about money. Okay, the more really good, well-designed research, you pay people for their data. And there's ways to do that. You know, self-report is going to be, you're so right, such an issue. Self-report for dietary intake, for example. You know, what did you eat last week? Well, I don't know. I remember some of it, you know, but it's going to be vague because I didn't write it down. But if I'm in a study and you want to find out my diet, you know, you can pay me to do 24-hour recalls. And if you do 3 of them, especially if the 24-hour recall is done with a researcher, you know, there's some that you do online by yourselves, and then there's some where researcher can administer. Studies show that if you collect at least 3 24-hour recalls at different times in a person's period of time, like, you know, weekday, weekend, stuff like that, and you can do an analysis that gets kind of close at nutrient intake. Okay, but so that's one thing. It's very imperfect. Absolutely, you're right. When it gets, and that's the same, but when it comes down to breastfeeding, the way to get good data is to pay them well and use apps and things like that for people to enter in. So every time you breastfeed, say how long you did it, and just, you know, you can submit that information. So there's more, and this is a really cool concept. If you know, people are still going to lie or be lazy or whatever, because that's how humans are, but a lot of them will be You still will get better data than if you say, hey, what did you do last month? Okay, so there's research avenues that are a little better, but it's always a problem. Yeah, and that's why we keep changing our mind about, do fruits and vegetables really prevent cancer? Well, yes, no, probably not. And so we just have to do the best we can. That's why everybody thinks they know more about nutrition than we do. And they don't. They just don't understand. Really, in education and nutrition is to understand that there's a lot of things you don't know yet. That's what a really truly educated person is. And the difference. When some research is strong, and then others is more iffy. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about what we know is pretty strong, and then what's a little iffier. So I'm going to address infant health outcomes, maternal health outcomes, benefits for families and societies. I have strong feelings about these things. So this is from one of those position papers that I showed you at the beginning. And this is infant outcomes, and we're looking at the evidence. So here's potential outcomes that are affected by infants as to whether or not they're breastfed or formula fed. And here's some conditions for which there is strong evidence that breastfeeding affects it. And here's a table where there is some evidence that breastfeeding may be important. Okay, this doesn't mean these are throwaway. It just means we're still at that stage of, well, I'm not really quite sure. There's some evidence. So let's look at these things. We know that when breastfed, infants are fully breastfed, they have fewer GI infections. You've seen why, right? You look at HMOs, it makes total sense. They have fewer respiratory infections. Human milk has antibodies in it. Sudden infant death syndrome, breastfed infants are less likely to have this. I can't really tell you the reason. There's some theories behind it that have to do with the feeding process, or maybe the baby's close to mom and so forth, but there's a definite strong evidence that necrotizing enterocolitis that I talked about, strong evidence that breastfeeding protects that, and overweight or obesity, strong evidence. So these are pretty strong evidence that breastfeeding benefits infants in some ways. In other ways, we're still not sure, but there's some evidence that dermatitis, type 1 diabetes, cognitive development, this evidence is stronger in premature infants. If an infant is born premature and fed formula, let's say it's born a month or two early and only fed formula, there will be a difference in cognitive function compared to that infant and one that's given human milk. Now at term, two babies are born at term, or two groups of babies are born at term. There seems to be some genetic variability. Some kids really do respond to breastfeeding. It does seem to enhance IQ, but it's not across the board. So that's why it's in the some evidence column. Asthma is a potential, and also the other things that go along with excess weight, such as type 2 diabetes. So does this make sense how we can only, we don't want to overstate. I'm so against doing that because it's immoral to lie, but it's also unethical to hold back this type of information so people can make wise decisions. Okay, the next table is on maternal outcomes. And again, it's set up the exact same way. And look at this, postpartum hemorrhage. Remember we talked about that last time? We talked about how oxytocin, mom doesn't like it. She puts the baby to the breast, and the oxytocin causes a milk ejection. At the same time, it squeezes her uterus, and that can hurt. It feels like childbirth a little bit. It's uncomfortable, but it's also helping to contract the uterus so that hemorrhaging is less common or less likely to happen. And also a delay in ovulation. We talked about this last time too. If she feeds on a regular basis, the baby's with her, and milk is removed from the breast on a regular basis, she's a lot likely to not ovulate for a period of time. And I was one of those people that breastfed my kid for over a year, my daughter over a year. I forget how long it was. It was in the hippie days, right? 1985. And I didn't ovulate for over a year. It's the best thing that ever happened. When you live a life of menstruating, then all of a sudden you don't menstruate anymore for a while. It's really fun, right? It also helps you get your iron stores back together again, so you can have another kid, because you need to have good iron status, right? So it can help with that. And also there's a connection with postpartum depression that's pretty good, pretty important. And then there's other evidence that's there but it's in the some evidence category. Postpartum weight status is an interesting one. People want to say, well, if you breastfeed, then all that fat will come off. But you know what happens when you breastfeed? You're hungry. And so you can't just eat this like low calorie diet and produce all this milk. Your body's hungry and it lets you know you need calories, you need fluid. And so a lot of times people have trouble losing their weight until they stop lactating. Some people can. It depends on what else they eat and their lifestyle and all that. So anyway, these are other issues. Now, one of the more interesting ones here is breast cancer. Studies show that the earlier a woman breastfeeds in her life and the more months spent breastfeeding is associated with decreased risk for breast cancer. And it has to do with the cells differentiating and so forth, and beyond the scope of this class, but it's of interest as well. So mom benefits, right? We talked about infant spacing and so forth, and the association with what I just talked about with the life duration of breastfeeding. And what about, I have families and society on the same slide here. So how does it help families? Well, it's free. If you're going to buy infant formula, I mentioned it can be up to $3,000 a year. And, you know, it's a little more fun to buy mom some more yummy calories, and so she produces the milk. There's a cost associated with breastfeeding and formula feeding anyway. If you do pump and store, you've got to pay for the baggies to do that with. If you use infant formula, you've got all the trash associated with that, but also the cost of that and cost of bottles and everything. So there's cost associated with breastfeeding is cheaper. People don't get sick as often. This is a hardcore fact. Mom's less likely to miss work if she's breastfeeding an infant. And if an infant is in care and they get sick, the whole family is less likely, or she and the infant are a lot less likely to get sick. What happens when you're a child, you get all these childhood illnesses, and then you have a kid, and if you put them in care, they're with other kids, they all catch whatever's going around, and then you get them all over again. So young parents or new parents are very likely to get very sick all over again. But if their child is breastfed, then the whole family does better. That's fact. All right, in society, well, less, you know, there's higher work productivity. The environment is something I could talk about for hours and hours. There's such a big impact on, you know, the growing cattle, dealing with the carcasses of cattle, how they're raised, the transportation of trucks involved, the amount of water that's used to raise cattle, to, you know, and so on. This is a huge impact on our environment. Transportation, and then and this is a huge one, lower healthcare costs. If you look at what's going on with our country today, especially Texas is the worst state for access to healthcare. There are more uninsured people in Texas than any other state. And so people don't have access. And if they do need to go, oftentimes it's catastrophic if they need to go get help. And so breastfeeding, if 90% of families breastfed exclusively for 6 months, we're looking at billions per year, and up to a year, even more. Okay, better health, better maternal health too. So it's a pro-health thing to do. Ready for me to keep going? Okay, so I've mentioned formula a lot. I sound like it's horrible. It's absolutely important. Some people can't breastfeed. Formula is the next best thing. You know, it's the only thing. You can't give them cow milk. But formula manufacturers have been pretty mean-spirited across over the period of time from which they became developed, because they've marketed aggressively to people particularly in low-income developing countries. They've marketed Malaysia, the Philippines, Venezuela, Guatemala, places like that have been heavily marketed to. Mothers are heavily marketed to historically. And what happened is they would see these jars with these cute babies on them, look all healthy and whatever, and they would say, feed this your kid, it's better than your breast milk. So they'll start to feed, so hospitals would get paid off to distribute the formula. So the doctors would write prescriptions, people go do that. As soon as they get the kid on formula, then their milk dries up, and it's really hard to get lactation back again. So remember how milk production is based on how much is removed from the breast. So if it's not being removed, she's not going to just have a supply going. And so then then you have a family addiction on this infant formula. If the water is not clean, which is a common thing, then infants die. This is a fact, and it's one of the dirtiest industries ever. Doesn't mean everything they do is bad. They provide an important service, but the marketing is heinous. I'm going to talk about how there are organizations that fight this very thing. So just want to kind of set the stage for this. You may have heard of the Nestle boycott. Nestle was considered, I think this is where the term the ugly American came from, because of the huge number of infant deaths that they caused. This happened again in the 1980s. It was just absolutely horrendous. It's expensive, and we talked about the environment already. Okay, so let's talk about the practical things. I told you we would talk about policy and then get into more practical issues. Before I do this, are there questions I'm missing? Let me take a breath here and see if something occurs to you that you would like to talk about. Are we getting into information overload yet? A lot of information. You have to say yes or no, because I can only see 5 of you right now.
Very good.
We're good.
Pardon me? Yes, overload?
We're good.
You're good? Okay.
It's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Now.
Thank you. I don't want to slam. I'm trying to keep my pace a little slower. It may not seem like it, but in class, it's easier to get the conversation going and kind of slow down the pace. And I want you guys to always feel comfortable. If you want to interrupt, if you want us to talk about something, you know, if it's off topic, I'll say, yeah, we'll get to that later. But if it's something that, and if I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know. But I just want to make sure your curiosity is assuaged, so you feel like you're getting the kind of information that you want to get. Breastfeeding is such an interesting thing. There are people can become lactation consultants, and some people that are very interested in maternal and child care can get that experience as well. It's just a really cool thing to be able to help people with. So what's this first feeding like? We showed last time the breast crawl, right? We showed the video of the breast crawl, and so in order to have the first experience really helpful, what you want to do is provide that skin contact, and you don't separate the mom and baby. You sure don't give them a bath and run them off to another room and give them a bottle, right? Which is how we used to do it in the 70s. That was pretty normal. Now people do rooming in, and so the baby's right there. Oftentimes it's nice for the partners to have some help from the medical staff before they leave home with a brand new human being, right? Because it's a little weird. You can wait for the vitamin K until after the first feeding. And these are hospital policies. If they're really, and I'll talk about this, if they're really interested in promoting breastfeeding, then they do these things. They're part of the birth plan. And when people are going to have a baby, they can develop a birth plan and say, this is how I want it to go. It doesn't always go that way, because they may have to have a surgical delivery or something, but they can say how they want it to go, so that their requests are honored. So ideally, the first feed happens within the first 30 minutes. I actually did this with my daughter in 1985, but birth took a long time, and so it took an hour before she could nurse. But she did pass meconium, which is the first poo that comes out of the baby, like all over me. So it's covered in this tar stuff. So that's my experience. It wasn't quite as pretty as that one. It got better after they cleaned her up. So during this time, they cry right at birth, and then they calm down. You saw the baby last time. It was kind of just hungry. He's chewing on his hands and climbing up mom and figuring it out. And so they'll figure it out. If they're medicated, it may not happen as quickly. We talked about that. And if it's not optimal, that's okay. Just don't offer formula. And this is where the formula industry has really interfered with breastfeeding, marketing to hospitals, having formula ever ready and go, oh, well, the baby needs to have calories. Now, sometimes babies do need calories. Kids can have low blood sugar. They'll check blood sugar. And if an infant's cratering, we're worried about, brain development. And so they can't have perennially low blood sugar. So there can be a reason to offer formula. I'm not against it. What I'm against doing, and what scientists are against doing, is automatically getting in and plugging this formula in. So what you can do if infants are having a crash in blood sugar, they can just get a little, instead of using a bottle, so they get used to drinking a bottle, they can just use little syringes and put some in their mouth just to help their blood sugar. And then that won't interfere with breastfeeding at all. So there's all kinds of practices they can do to make this work out. So anyway, this is the ideal setting here. So I'm going to stop here. And then the rest of this we'll be talking about how do you promote breastfeeding and what are some practical things, like what about positioning, and we'll talk some more about the latch and some problems that can interfere with breastfeeding. So I'm open for questions.